The storm had arrived without warning that November night, sweeping through the streets of New York with a fury that rattled windows and flooded gutters. Leah Moretti pushed through the revolving door of the cafe where she worked double shifts, her body aching from exhaustion, her mind clouded by the kind of weariness that comes from working too hard for too little. The rain soaked through her thin jacket within seconds, and she pulled her phone from her pocket with trembling fingers, desperate to hear her sister's voice, to find some comfort in the chaos of her life. She didn't look at the screen when she dialed. The numbers were muscle memory, or so she thought. The phone rang once, twice, and then a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the sound of the storm itself. When the voice came through the line, it was deep, measured, and cold, the kind of voice that commanded rooms and ended arguments with a single word. The voice said her name, not a question but a statement of fact. Leah. And in that moment, standing in the downpour with water streaming down her face, she felt her heart stop. No one was supposed to know her name from this number. This wasn't her sister. This was someone else entirely. The voice from the past. Adrian Valenti sat in his penthouse office overlooking the glittering skyline of Manhattan, surrounded by the trappings of power that came with being the most feared Mafia boss in the city. His empire stretched across boroughs and state lines, built on loyalty, fear, and an iron code of ethics that few understood, but all respected. He was reviewing reports from his underbosses when his private phone rang. The line that almost no one had access to, the line reserved for emergencies and matters of life and death. When he answered and heard the trembling breath on the other end, when he heard that voice whisper hello into the storm, something shifted in his chest. It was impossible, yet unmistakable. 15 years had passed since that night in the alley, since the teenage girl with dark eyes and steady hands had found him bleeding out behind a dumpster, since she'd pressed her scarf against his wounds and called for help while his attackers fled into the shadows. He had been nobody then, just another kid caught in the crossfire of gang violence, but she had saved him anyway. He had spent years searching for her, private investigators, old neighborhood contacts, every resource at his disposal, and all had come up empty. Leah Moretti had vanished from that neighborhood, moved away, left no trace, and now, by some twist of fate or cosmic accident, she had called him. The wrong number. Leah's mind raced as she stood frozen on the sidewalk. The voice on the other end asked if she knew who she was speaking to, and the question sent ice through her veins. There was something familiar in that voice, something that tugged at memories she had buried deep, memories of a frightened boy she had helped one night when she was 17, memories of blood and sirens, and the way his eyes had looked at her with gratitude and something else she couldn't name. Before she could respond, before she could even process what was happening, she heard shouting from the direction of her apartment building. Men's voices, harsh and urgent, calling her name. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in Queens, a modest place she could barely afford, but it was hers, her sanctuary, now that sanctuary was being violated. The voice on the phone changed. The cold authority was still there, but now there was urgency, a command that left no room for argument. He told her not to hang up, told her he was coming for her, and she heard the sounds of movement in the background, orders being barked, car engines roaring to life. The hunter and the hunted. What Leah didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that she had become a target 3 days earlier. A rival organization, one that had been attempting to undermine Adrian Valenti's operations for months, had discovered something through their intelligence networks. They had learned about the girl from 15 years ago, the girl who had saved the young Adrian Valenti's life, and they had tracked her down. Their plan was simple and brutal. Take her, use her as leverage, force the untouchable Mafia boss to make concessions or watch someone from his past suffer. They had no idea that Adrian had been searching for her for years, that she represented more than just a debt to be repaid. To him, she was the last moment of pure goodness in his life, the last time someone had helped him without wanting anything in return. Leah ran. She didn't go to her apartment. Instinct told her that would be suicide. Instead, she ducked into an alley beside her building, the phone still pressed to her ear, the voice on the other end guiding her through the darkness. He told her where to hide, how to stay quiet, and she followed his instructions because she had no other choice. The men who broke into her apartment were professionals, but they were also impatient. They tore through her belongings, looking for any clue about where she might have gone, and their noise covered the sound of her ragged breathing as she crouched behind a dumpster in the alley. The rain continued to fall, soaking her to the bone, and she wondered how her life had arrived at this moment, hiding in the dark while strangers hunted her for reasons she didn't understand. The cavalry arrives. Adrian Valenti's convoy descended on the Queen's neighborhood like a storm within a storm. Black SUVs with tinted windows, men in expensive suits carrying expensive weapons, all coordinated with military precision. His underboss had questioned the wisdom of the boss personally leading this operation, but one look at Adrian's face had silenced any objections. This wasn't about territory or money or power, this was personal. The rival organization's men never stood a chance. Adrian's forces surrounded the building, cut off all escape routes, and moved in with overwhelming force. There were no negotiations, no warnings. This was a message being sent, a line being drawn, and everyone in the criminal underworld would hear about it by morning. Leah heard the gunfire and pressed herself deeper into the shadows. The voice on the phone, which had been steady and calm throughout her ordeal, told her to stay exactly where she was, that it was almost over. She trusted that voice now, had no choice but to trust it, even though she still didn't fully understand who was on the other end. When Adrian himself appeared at the mouth of the alley, flanked by two of his most trusted men, Leah's breath caught in her throat. He was tall, imposing, dressed in a tailored suit that somehow remained immaculate despite the rain. His face was hard, carved from determination and years of making impossible decisions, but his eyes. When those eyes found her huddled behind the dumpster, something in them softened, recognition. He dismissed his men with a gesture and approached her alone. When he was close enough that she could see his face clearly in the dim light from the street, when she could see the faint scar on his left temple, a scar she had watched a paramedic stitch closed 15 years ago, the recognition hit her like a physical blow. She said his name, the name she had learned that night in the alley when she was 17, and he was bleeding and scared. Adrian. He had been just a kid then, someone caught in circumstances beyond his control. Now he was something else entirely, something powerful and dangerous, yet he looked at her with the same gratitude she remembered from that night. He helped her to her feet, and she noticed that his hands were gentle, despite their obvious strength. He explained, his voice low and urgent, that she was in danger because of him, because someone had discovered what she had done for him all those years ago. He told her that the men who had come for her tonight wouldn't be a problem anymore, that he had made certain of that, but there would be others. The safe house. Adrian took her to one of his safe houses, a luxury apartment in Midtown that was registered under a shell corporation and unknown to all but his most trusted advisors. Leah sat wrapped in a blanket, while his personal doctor checked her for injuries, finding nothing but exhaustion and shock. The contrast between this gilded cage and her modest apartment in Queens was almost absurd, like stepping into a different world. Over the next several days, as Adrian's organization worked to eliminate the threat against her, Leah began to understand the magnitude of what her simple act of kindness 15 years ago had set in motion. Adrian visited her daily, sometimes for hours, and they talked. He told her about his life, how he had clawed his way up from nothing, how he had built an empire on the foundation of loyalty and fear, how he had never forgotten the girl who had saved him when she had no reason to. She learned about the code he lived by, a moral framework that seemed contradictory to outsiders, but made perfect sense within the world he inhabited. He was capable of terrible violence, had ordered deaths and destroyed lives, yet he was also fiercely loyal to those under his protection and held to principles that governed his every decision. Leah, in turn, told him about her life, the struggles, the double shifts, the constant fight to stay afloat in a city that devoured the weak. She had moved away from the old neighborhood after her father died, had tried to build something better for herself, and failed more times than she cared to count. There was no bitterness in her voice when she spoke, only a quiet resilience that Adrian recognized and admired. The investigation. While Adrian spent his days with Leah, his organization was conducting a thorough investigation into how the rival group had discovered her identity. What they uncovered was troubling. Someone within Adrian's own organization had been feeding information to his enemies, someone close enough to have access to his private files and personal matters. The betrayal cut deep. Adrian prided himself on the loyalty of his family, on the bonds of trust that held his empire together. To discover that someone had violated that trust for money or power was worse than any business loss. His underboss, a man who had served faithfully for over a decade, led the internal investigation with ruthless efficiency. They found the traitor within a week. It was one of his captains, a man who had grown resentful of Adrian's success and had been seduced by promises of power from the rival organization. The discovery of Leah had been the information he had traded for his 30 pieces of silver, never imagining that Adrian would respond with such overwhelming force. Adrian dealt with the betrayal personally, in the way that such betrayals had always been handled in his world. Leah never asked for details, and he never offered them, but she noticed the shadow that crossed his face for days afterward. Betrayal from an enemy was expected, but betrayal from family left scars that never fully healed. Growing closer, as the immediate danger passed, as Adrian's forces dismantled the rival organization piece by piece in retaliation for the attempt on Leah's life, something unexpected began to develop between them. What had started as a debt to be repaid, as protection offered out of gratitude, slowly transformed into something neither of them had anticipated. Leah saw beyond the fearsome reputation, beyond the violence and power, to the man underneath. She saw someone who carried the weight of countless lives and decisions, someone who had been shaped by circumstances and choices into something both remarkable and terrifying. She saw the boy from the alley still there, buried beneath years of hardening, but not entirely lost. Adrian, for his part, found in Leah something he had thought lost to him forever. Genuine human connection, untainted by fear or ambition. She didn't want anything from him except honesty and respect. She challenged his decisions, questioned his methods, and refused to be intimidated by his reputation. In a world where everyone either feared him or wanted to use him, she simply saw him. They would spend evenings talking, sometimes until dawn. He would tell her about the complexities of his business, the impossible choices between bad and worse, the weight of knowing that his decisions affected hundreds of families. She would listen without judgment, offering perspectives that came from a life lived entirely outside his world. She taught him to see things differently, to remember that there was more to life than power and control. He showed her a world of luxury and influence she had never imagined. But more importantly, he showed her that she was valued, that she mattered beyond her ability to work double shifts and barely survive. The threat returns. Just when it seemed that safety had been secured, that the rival organization had been sufficiently crippled, a new threat emerged. The FBI had been building a case against Adrian Valenti for years, and the recent violence had given them the opportunity they needed to move forward with indictments. Federal agents began surveilling all of Adrian's known properties, including the safe house where Leah was staying. His lawyers warned that association with him could make her a target of the investigation, could potentially implicate her in crimes she knew nothing about. Adrian faced an impossible choice: keep her close and risk destroying her life with legal consequences, or send her away to protect her from the fallout of his world. Leah made the decision for him. She announced that she was leaving, that she would disappear the way she had 15 years ago, that this time she would make sure no one could find her. It was the only way to protect both of them, her from his world's consequences and him from the distraction of worrying about her safety when he needed to focus on survival. Adrian argued against it, but she was resolute. She had survived on her own for years before their paths crossed again, and she would continue to survive. The night before she was scheduled to leave, they sat together in the safe house, the city lights glittering below them, and finally acknowledged what had grown between them. The truth revealed. It was in that moment of vulnerability, as they faced the reality of separation, that Adrian told her the complete truth. The wrong number she had dialed hadn't been wrong at all. He had been tracking her sister for months, had obtained her new phone number, and had been preparing to reach out to Leah through her. When Leah had called that night, she had dialed a single wrong digit and reached his private line instead of her sister's similar number. But the timing, the storm, the immediate threat from his enemies, all of that had been real. The rival organization had been watching her, preparing to move, and her accidental call had been the only thing that saved her life. If she had called her sister instead, if she had gone home that night without his warning, she would have walked directly into their trap. Leah processed this revelation in silence. Part of her felt manipulated, felt that their reconnection had been manufactured rather than fated. But another part understood that he had been searching for her for the same reason she had never forgotten him. Because sometimes a single moment of genuine human kindness can echo through a lifetime. The decision. The next morning, Leah was supposed to leave. Adrian had arranged for a new identity, a bank account that would keep her comfortable, and transportation to anywhere in the country she wanted to go. His men waited downstairs with the car, and her small bag was packed. But she didn't leave. Instead, she made a different choice. She told Adrian that she would stay, but on her terms. She wouldn't hide in safe houses or live in the shadows of his world. She would continue to work, continue to live her life, and he would have to find a way to make that possible while keeping her safe. It was an impossible demand, and they both knew it. His world and hers couldn't coexist without consequences. But Adrian Valenti had built an empire by finding solutions to impossible problems, by refusing to accept limitations that others considered absolute. The new normal. Over the following months, they constructed something unprecedented. Leah returned to work at the cafe, but now there were always protective details nearby, invisible but present. She moved into a better apartment. Nothing ostentatious but safe and comfortable, in a neighborhood where Adrian's influence ensured her protection without making her a target. She learned to navigate the complexities of his world while maintaining her independence. She met members of his organization, earned their respect through her refusal to be intimidated or impressed by their power. She became, in her own way, part of his family while remaining distinctly herself. Adrian, in turn, began to change. The man who had ruled through fear and calculated violence started to consider different approaches, alternative solutions. Leah's perspective, her insistence that there were always choices, even when they seemed limited, influenced decisions that affected hundreds of lives. His underboss noticed the change and worried about weakness, but what appeared as softness to some was actually a different kind of strength. The strength to question assumptions, to evolve beyond the patterns that had defined him for years. The federal case. The FBI's investigation continued, building momentum toward inevitable indictments. Adrian's lawyers prepared for the legal battle, but everyone knew that the government's resources were vast and their determination unwavering. Leah watched him carry this burden, saw the stress etched in new lines around his eyes, and wished she could do more than simply be there. What she didn't know was that Adrian had been preparing for this eventuality for years. He had kept meticulous records, had documentation of corruption within the agencies investigating him, had evidence that could bring down politicians and law enforcement officials. It was his insurance policy, his final defense against those who would destroy everything he had built. But using that evidence would mean war on a scale that would dwarf anything the city had seen in decades. It would mean exposing himself to even greater danger, putting everyone associated with him at risk, including Leah. He struggled with the decision, weighing his survival against the potential cost to those he cared about. The sacrifice. In the end, Adrian made a choice that surprised everyone who knew him. He decided to cooperate with federal investigators to provide information on criminal organizations and corrupt officials in exchange for immunity and a chance to walk away from the life he had built. It was a betrayal of everything he had stood for, a violation of the code he had lived by. His underboss called it surrender, and several of his captains considered it grounds for removal. But Adrian didn't care about their opinions anymore. He cared about building a future where Leah didn't have to live with guards and threats. He cared about proving that the boy from the alley, the one she had saved 15 years ago, was still capable of choosing a different path. The negotiations took months. Federal prosecutors wanted everything: names, operations, financial records, decades of criminal activity exposed and documented. Adrian gave them most of what they wanted, holding back only the information that would endanger innocent people or those who had served him loyally without committing unforgivable acts. The aftermath. When it was over, when the indictments had been handed down and the organization he had built for years began to crumble, Adrian Valenti disappeared. The newspapers reported his cooperation, speculated about his whereabouts, and declared the end of his empire. What they didn't know was that he and Leah had left the city together. New identities, new lives, a small town in the Pacific Northwest where no one knew or cared about mafia bosses and federal investigations. He took a job managing a local security firm, using his skills in ways that helped rather than harmed. Leah opened a small bookstore, something she had always dreamed about but never thought possible. They lived quietly, anonymously, and for the first time in either of their lives, they lived without looking over their shoulders. Reflection. Some nights, when the rain fell like it had that night when everything changed, they would sit together and talk about the improbable chain of events that had brought them here. A wrong number that was actually the right number. A storm that provided cover, a decision made 15 years earlier to help a bleeding stranger in an alley. Leah would sometimes wonder what would have happened if she had looked at her phone screen that night, if she had dialed correctly and reached her sister instead. Adrian would remind her that fate had its own plans, that sometimes wrong turns lead to exactly where you need to be. They never returned to New York. The life they had left behind continued without them. New organizations rose to fill the power vacuum. Federal cases proceeded through the courts, and the city moved on the way cities always do. But occasionally, Adrian would receive encrypted messages from his former underboss, now running what remained of the organization along more legitimate lines, reporting that the family was surviving and adapting. The legacy years passed quietly. The bookstore became a community fixture, and Adrian's security firm earned a reputation for integrity and competence. They made friends who knew them only as ordinary people, who never suspected the lives they had lived before, but they never forgot who they had been, what they had survived together. The wrong number call remained their private joke, their secret origin story. Sometimes Leah would pick up her phone and pretend to dial wrong, and Adrian would answer in that deep, cold voice he had once used to command an empire, saying her name the way he had that storm-swept night. And then they would laugh, because they had escaped the gravity of their pasts and built something neither had thought possible. They had found each other not once but twice, and the second time they had chosen to keep each other. The unexpected visitor. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn when the stranger walked into Leah's bookstore. He was young, maybe early 20s, with nervous eyes and a package wrapped in brown paper. He asked for her by name, her real name, the one she hadn't used in years. Adrian appeared from the back room, where he had been reviewing security equipment orders, his hand instinctively moving to where he used to carry a weapon before remembering that he didn't anymore. The young man saw him and smiled, a genuine smile, not threatening. He explained that he was the son of one of Adrian's former captains, one of the men who had served loyally and been protected during the federal cooperation. His father had sent him with a message and a gift. The package contained a photo album. Inside were pictures from the old neighborhood, from 15 years ago, including one that made Leah's breath catch. It was a grainy surveillance photo that someone had taken the night she saved Adrian, showing a teenage girl kneeling beside a bleeding boy in an alley, her scarf pressed against his wounds. Adrian's former captain had kept this photo for years, had given it to his son with instructions to find them and deliver it along with a message. The message was simple. The family remembered, the family was grateful, and the family would always consider Adrian Valenti their Don, regardless of where he was or what path he had chosen. Full circle. After the young man left, Leah and Adrian sat together looking at the photograph. She saw the girl she had been, frightened but determined, helping because it was the right thing to do, regardless of the risk. He saw the moment that had changed everything, the kindness that had echoed through 15 years and ultimately saved them both. They framed the photo and hung it in their private office, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. It represented the truth that a single moment of compassion could alter the trajectory of lives, that choosing to help rather than walk away could set in motion events that reshaped the world. The wrong number had been the right number after all. Fate, coincidence, divine intervention. Whatever force had guided Leah's fingers to dial that specific sequence of digits on a storm-swept night had known something they didn't. It had known that they needed each other, that they were meant to find each other again, and that together they could become something neither could have been alone.